Why does the Pope have a country? Located in the bustling heart of the nearly 3,000-year-old city of Rome is the Vatican, the ornate headquarters of global Catholicism and the home of its leader, the Pope. But the Pope, whomever that might be, doesn't just head a religion, he runs a country. At less than a square kilometre in size, Vatican City is the smallest country in the world. Physically developed over centuries, its most notable features consist of the Apostolic Palace, the Sistine Chapel, extensive archives and tombs, private gardens, and the world-famous St. Peter's Basilica. All its attractions, besides its gift shop, are far older, though, than the political entity that is the Vatican City-State. Since 1929, the Vatican has been the sovereign territory of the Holy See. That's in spite of the fact that it's totally surrounded by Italy. From the Latin sedis, see refers to a seat, specifically a bishop's throne, in this case that of the Bishop of Rome, the Pope. In essence, the Holy See is the continuing office of the Papacy as popes come and go. Unlike Vatican City, the Holy See has had an independent sovereign status since the early Middle Ages. For many centuries, popes were the ultimate moral and often legal authority across much of Europe and beyond. They also ruled a country of their own, a proper-sized one at this point, which covered Rome and much of central Italy. Really starting with Napoleon, though, nation-building and rejection of divine right to rule began to challenge the Pope's status, and ultimately, the reason for the existence of the city-state today is to meet the Catholic Church's demand for its historic independence. Modern Vatican City was born in 1929 out of an agreement, the Lateran Pacts, between Pope Pius XI and none other than Benito Mussolini. Lateran resolved a 6-decade-long acrid dispute between the Church and the Kingdom of Italy, which had conquered the Papal States in 1870. It was a cynical move on Mussolini's part, meant to boost his appeal among Italy's many traditionalist Catholics. For the Church, coming to terms with Italy was an inevitability that Mussolini at least seemed willing to smooth over. Roughly contained within 9th century walls built by Pope Leo IV around the ancient Mons Vaticanus, since 1870, 4 popes had lived and died as prisoners of the Vatican, choosing never to leave it during their pontificates in protest of Italy's occupation of Rome. On September 20th, 1870, Royal Italian troops had breached the city's outer Aurelian walls, completing the unification of Italy by finishing off the Papal States. Rome was triumphantly made Italy's capital. The Quirinal Palace was taken as a residence for King Victor Emmanuel of the House of Savoy, and Pope Pius IX was left isolated within the leonine walls of the Vatican around St. Peter's, with no recourse but to fume in the Apostolic Palace and issue excommunications of the invaders. The origin of Pius and his successors' papal problems, as with so many things, was the French Revolution. France occupied the Italian peninsula between 1800 and 1814 and gave Italy's feudal social structure shock therapy of constitutional, relatively liberal rule. The Papal States, which had been the Holy See's earthly domain since the 8th century, was abolished outright by Napoleon. When Europe's counter-revolutionary powers eventually triumphed over the emperor, though, the old order was restored. Backed by the military might of Catholic Austria, for a few decades after 1815, the Papal States would successfully resist efforts by Italian nationalist and liberal revolutionaries to subvert the Pope's temporal power. That relationship failed in the wake of Europe's revolutions of 1848, and in early 1849, leading nationalist Giuseppe Mazzini and others forced out Pius IX just 2 years after his coronation, proclaiming a Roman Republic. Papal control was eventually restored, this time by French troops, sent by the newly elected president, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, who was eager to win over his own Catholic population. But it was a temporary reprieve. Though Austria had crushed northern Italian revolutionaries led by the House of Savoy, with Marshal Radetzky remarking, "Spare the enemy generals, for they are too valuable to our side," at the Battle of Custoza, within a decade the Italians were on the march again. They rallied around the Savoyard kingdom of Piedmont-Sardinia. Soon Milan and Tuscany fell, later Venice too. The revolutionary Garibaldi sailed to Sicily and raised the Italian banner there in 1860, and Victor Emmanuel was declared King of Italy in 1861, with his forces taking 2/3 of the Papal States to physically unite the new kingdom. For a time, the Pope still held Rome. Louis Napoleon, now Napoleon III, guarded the rump Papal States for 9 years until the Second French Empire met its end after the Battle of Sedan. The end of the Papal States was much less dramatic. When the Italians breached the Eternal City in September of 1870, Pius IX ordered his vastly outnumbered papal forces to put up a token resistance. Many were volunteers from across the Catholic world, and the Pope was intent on proving that the Holy See had not capitulated willingly. For their part, the Italians offered to recognize the Pope's spiritual independence and grant the Holy See control, but not sovereignty, over the Leonine city. Pius IX and his successors refused to accept Italy's legal existence. A healthy helping of institutional stubbornness is why the Roman question dogged papal-Italian relations for decades as popes holed up in the Vatican complex. Which brings us to Mussolini. He found Pope Pius XI, not to be confused with Pius IX, much as he found many Italians. That's to say, put off by Il Duce's more thuggish qualities, but nevertheless accepting him as necessary to stave off advances of Bolshevism and secularism. So the Lateran Pacts were made. Most importantly to the Church, Italy agreed to cede the Vatican to the popes, recognizing the Holy See's sovereignty over a sovereign Vatican city-state. Other significant church properties, including the Lateran Palace where the pacts were signed, remained Italian soil but came under the Vatican's extraterritorial jurisdiction in much the same way that foreign embassies do. For his part, Pius XI agreed to recognize Italy as a legitimate country with Rome as its capital and to not speak out on Italian politics, say by condemning its leader. He became monarch of Vatican City, as all popes have been, by definition, since. He was also the first pope to step foot outside of the Leonine walls since the end of the Papal States. The Church had achieved its guarantee of independence, and the world received an oddity in the theocratic microstate led by an elected absolute monarch who rules virtually no population but influences hundreds of millions. And Lateran survived post-Mussolini. The why behind that is pretty straightforward. The resolver may have been unpleasant, but the issue was resolved. It's in no one's interest to try to get rid of Vatican City, and so, while the successors of St. Peter will come and go, the state surrounding his basilica remains, and likely will for a good while to come.